Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special panel discussion at the Copenhagen Fashion Summit, which of course is championing the intersection of fashion and sustainability, tapping into the people and perspectives that drive the industry forward. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it is an absolute privilege to be the moderator of this critically important conversation. Now, our panel is focusing on value versus volume. How can scale be used as a force for good? Now, of course, as we take on this topic, we know that reducing overproduction is often pointed to as a lever that we can pull if we want to cut emissions, as well as to regain some of the $500 billion of value that we lose each and every year. But we've also got to think about the knock-on effects on consumers who are looking at the higher prices. We've got to look at the producers who are also looking at profitability. Of course, the big question is, if we want fashion to really live up to its potential to be a force for good, can scale be a part of this? This is the anchor of the conversation we're about to have. Alongside me, I'm pleased to welcome Rosalina Petrova. She is a member of the cabinet of the EU Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries, and she is coming into this conversation with a wealth of insight and experience. She works towards accelerating the transition to a more circular economy and making sustainable products the norm and ensuring a sustainable recovery from the crisis. In addition, we're joined by Kenya Wiley. She is Policy Counsel and Professor at Georgetown University and at the Fashion Law Institute at Fordham Law School. She has conducted research. She's written on a range of issues that look at the intersection of fashion law, of politics and with policy, with bylines in WWD, in Fashionista, in Elle. She's been featured across many platforms, including CNN. So, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we are in capable hands. And maybe, Rosalina, I'll come to you first with the first question. Fashion can be a force for good, for people, and for the planet. What would need to be true, or what would need to change from a value and a value perspective for the statement to be true, for the statement that fashion can be a force for good, for people and planet? From a volume and value perspective, what would need to change for this to be true?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. Indeed, what we are discussing today is a very important conversation that we've been having, and we have to have more, because indeed the textiles, they are really the fabric of our life. They are our second skin, but at the same time, they are a source of a lot of negative environmental impacts from greenhouse gas emissions to pollution and other forms of environmental degradation. So that's why we have to get it right. We have to get it right. And indeed, when we talk about creating value, it's not always about the volume. So we have to, my most important message of today is that we have to love our clothes, and the main value comes indeed from having clothes that are high quality, that are durable, where the cent per wear, per times that we wear them, is actually this value reduces for the consumer, and then actually where producers are extracting this value from first of all having less impact on the environment through using less polluting chemicals, more recycled materials, then through making more high quality and durable clothes that really provide value to the consumers, and then making sure that we also close the loop through when finally we cannot use and reuse these clothes, that we actually deliver them them for proper recycling so that they can again fit into the economy. So it's really a full circle, but since this is a global chain, it's difficult to link all the dots. And I really hope that conversations like the one we are having today will help in that and make us link all the dots in order to do this transition together.
Rosalina, I think it's a fantastic start to our conversation. The invitation for us to decouple value from volume, the invitation for us to rethink the way that we produce, the invitation to love our clothes, the invitation to think about the full circle, but not shy away from the complexity of global value chains, because we have to connect the dots, as you say. Kenya, let me come to you. I think what's clear is that we need to get the fashion volume and value balance right. But I'm also wanting us to have an honest conversation about who are the winners and losers today. And is there a scenario where there are more winners and less losers while we try to get this balance right?
Thank you, Nosy. And I'd also like to give a special thank you to Global Fashion Agenda for bringing us all together today to have this very important and timely discussion. And in terms of winners, I'm going to start out and say that Global Fashion Agenda is a winner today, right? Because they are bringing industry, government, and academia all together to address these very challenging issues. Oftentimes we discuss them as if the burden is solely on the fashion industry, and it is not. We must all work together. I would say another winner in this area, it's really in what I call the fashion tech companies, the fashion brands and retailers that have been able to integrate technology into their platforms so that they can have sustainable practices, if that means sourcing and producing locally, while also offering products globally, because they've been able to use artificial intelligence and they have a sophisticated delivery and logistics operation. We can discuss this further, but we've seen how this has actually played out during the current pandemic. And then we also must remember the business to business companies, the B2B companies and fashion tech that are developing the tech solutions and the sustainable solutions on the back end. We don't always see them front and center, but they're pretty much working behind the scenes and helping the brands and retailers bring their innovations to life and to all of the consumers. Also, as far as the losers in this space, I would say it's the companies, the brands and retailers that have been slow to adapt and evolve in the current environment. We've seen this again play out in the pandemic. A lot of those companies didn't make it, some did, but hopefully we'll see more companies really embrace fashion technology and moving forward.
Yeah, Kenya, thank you so much. It's such a clear distinction between what is it that puts you in the camp of winners and what is it that's going to leave you behind in the camp of winners, of losers. What I'm excited about is the bridge for more people to become winners. And as you say, if you're slow to adapt, can you still fast track and accelerate and begin to move in the right direction? Rosalina, I just want to go back to the point you mentioned about global value chains. And I want to ask the question whether trade policy can play a role in ensuring that we're getting the balance right in terms of getting more value and decoupling value from volume. Can trade policy play a role in pushing for this positive change?
Trade, definitely. As I mentioned, the textile value chain is particularly complicated because it really spreads globally. There are many interrelated actors, starting from the production of the raw materials, of the fibers, for the fibers, then to the production of the textiles themselves, then indeed to making of the clothes, to shipping them, to actually selling them. So it's and then of course the consumers, they also have a role, and then all the closing the cycle, and then the reverse logistics. So it's a very complicated value chain, and here it's very important the key players in these value chains, those key actors that have the leverage to change the value chain for the good, to take their responsibility. And that is where due diligence is very important. That is where sustainable corporate governance is very important, where producers really have a role to make sure that what they source is sustainable. How the clothes are produced is also sustainable, in particular from a social perspective, because this has been a huge issue, and that's a big stain on the textile and fashion industry. Actually, the way how our clothes are produced, and then that's something that needs to change so that we could be proud of the clothes that we wear, and then also. There is a producer responsibility that has to be taken for the end of life. And this is particularly what we'll be looking at.
Rosalina, I think it's great that you've highlighted some very practical actions from due diligence to governance to, paying particular attention to what we're putting out in the world from a producer perspective. What about consumers? Is there something that consumers could do, Rosalina, more actively to ensure that they are contributing to the sustainability of fashion?
Of course, as consumers, we have a lot of power, but sometimes we feel weak. So I don't, from a policy perspective, I don't always like putting all the burden on consumers. Consumers have a role, but sometimes the producers are stronger. But if we have to focus on consumers, indeed, information can empower. So if we give our consumers the right information, also sound information that they don't doubt, if we make sure that those green claims that are made on the products, on textiles, they are really substantiated, that there is really an effort behind them to be more green, to be sustainable, then consumers would know what they buy, and they will be able to be proud of the clothes that they wear. And then in addition, where consumers also have a role is in, let's say, appreciating better what we call sometimes vintage clothing. So to actually engage more in the second-hand market, more in reuse, in repair of their clothes, and in this way actually also ensure that those sector of social enterprises is supported, and then actually the value of the textile value chain will increase much more, because in terms of social value and in terms of economic value as well.
So Rosalina, I mean, you've led us to talking about power, and I'm going to come to you, Kenya, to talk a little bit about power, because as you started off, you said, you don't like to put the burden of responsibility on consumers, but as we've listened to you, sharing some of the ways consumers can exercise their agency, whether it's through the choice of vintage or secondhand or reuse, or just making sure that they have the information of how they've attained that particular garment. All of these really speak to the untapped power potentially that sits within consumers. And one would imagine leverage together with producers could really create the change that we're looking to. So maybe, Kenya, let's talk about power a little bit more. And I want to maybe start off with the idea that disruption always creates the opportunity to reset the blueprint and to rethink. And we know that the global pandemic certainly has disrupted supply chains across industries. I'm keen to understand from your perspective, what does that disruption look like from a fashion industry perspective? But then secondly, whether there is an opportunity to reset the blueprint in a way that allows us to derive more value and allow maybe scale to play a role in that.
Thank you, Nosy. First of all, I would like to point out, and thank you, Rosalina, for bringing up vintage. I'm actually wearing a vintage scarf today that I got from a friend of mine. She has a boutique here in Washington, D.C. So I consider myself a consumer, a responsible consumer. I shop vintage. And as far as how to disrupt in the power system, I would say something that I always lead with. I teach a course on fashion law and social justice at both Georgetown and Fordham Law School. And one part that we always lead with in class, and that is to put humanity and social justice first at every step. That's for fashion industry, for consumers, for academia, for government, for everyone. And we're starting to see this play out right now in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure that we have diverse talent throughout the pipeline. We're seeing that, and throughout fashion supply chain as well. Another area that we really need disruption, and that is to get past what I call the hype and the hashtags, and really discuss how we can make real change and make that change. I'll give you one example. Here last year in the United States, Congress passed a bill. It's called the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act. It has two main parts: to address plastics pollution and also to promote the circular economy, not just in fashion, but across industries. That legislation got very little media coverage. And now the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, they're in the process of implementing that legislation. It has significant, it will, and it does have a significant impact on not just the fashion industry, but other industries as well, for grants around plastics packaging, how to have sustainable packaging as well, how to deal with post-consumer waste. I bring that up because, like I mentioned, it hasn't gotten that much media coverage, but it's a way that we can leverage our resources with government and industry and our consumers so that we can all make a difference and help disrupt the current system.
Kenya, I think you've just raised a very, very important point, and I think it's a challenge at a personal level to all of us about what I would describe as the duplicity that I think we sometimes show up as. And I want to bring in this, this contradiction to say, and you spoke about beyond hype and hashtags, and we know how we all love hype and hashtags, but we also love Fashion Week, and we also love looking out for the latest items. And, contrary to what Rosalina was sharing with us, looking out what's coming up next season, rather than saying, how do I love my beautiful beaded necklace that was made by a woman in Lusiki in South Africa a little bit more and a little bit longer. From a human behavioral perspective, Kenya, have we got the messaging right to say, this is the action that we need to see, this is the behavior that we'd really like to see, and simplify to the ordinary person on the ground what is good behavior and what isn't in this particular space?
To be honest, Nosy, no, I don't believe we've gotten the messaging right yet, but it's not too late. And we're in a very difficult time right now because we're coming out of a global pandemic. As you mentioned, we've had fashion weeks around the world. And so we're human. We want to go out, we want to engage, we want to buy, we want to shop, we want to socialize with our friends. But how can we do that in a way where we're still being responsible and we're working with industry so that as they're promoting new collections, that we're doing it in, like I mentioned, a sustainable manner. Another issue that's come up is digital commerce. Digital commerce is not going away, but we also see how that contributes to waste when we think about all of the packaging involved in whether that's plastic or additional paper. And so in addition to focusing on the actual materials, I think we also need to look at more sustainable options for packaging as we have more digital commerce and consumers are buying more online and they're getting them in boxes and bags, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a fantastic response, especially when we think about the trend of unboxing. I think is the actual trend where you need to show this beautiful thing and the packaging that it came with. Imagine if it was sustainable packaging that we could be showcasing alongside that. I do want us to start talking about the future, but before I do that, Rosalina, one of the things that I think we mustn't lose sight of is whether we have put together a strong enough business case for change. So for example, we know that producers are always going to have their eye on profits. We know that consumers are always going to have an eye on prices. How do we make sure that despite those concerns, that we have articulated the case for change strongly enough that we can overcome those inertias and hurdles if they exist?
Yeah, that's not an easy question, and there is no single answer or a silver bullet how this can happen. As I said, we have to act on many different fronts in order to ensure first that prices are right, because in many cases prices are not right. We see a lot of subsidies for different part of the value chains that make sure that sometimes the relative prices of the clothing fall, although their price in terms of impact on the environment and what we have to pay in the end as society for pollution actually increases. Then, of course, if people would use their clothes just a little bit double time, just twice as much as they do currently, we will have 2 times less greenhouse gas emissions from our clothes. And then also we will save as consumers, and we will also provoke the industry as such to make more durable clothes. And as such, there will be gains and savings and benefits all along the system. But we have to get the incentives right. So we have to make it more fashionable to have higher quality, durable clothes, because what we see actually is that a lot of the increase in volume comes also from plastic fibers. So they come from polyester, polyethylene, what we normally have our water bottles in, and then this becomes clothes. It's recycled content. It's not the best recycled content that you can get, because then we have the microplastic pollution, of course. But a lot of this comes actually from increasing in those artificial fibers, which come with a lot of undesired effects. So the question is, there are many aspects to the sustainability equation, and we have to act on all of them in order to make sure that change happens. But I'm very hopeful, because we see vintage clothes being fashionable. This is not one, but I have worn it so many times that I think that because I love it. But we have to act really on many fronts in order to provoke change.
So we need to get the incentives right. And that's such a very strong message. And as you were speaking, Rosalina and Kenya, I was reflecting on the pictures from the Met Gala, which I think happened a week and a bit ago. And I was thinking to myself, imagine if some of those stars just arrived in the same gown that they wore another year or a previous year, and the power that messaging would send just to say, this is the new normal, and we are loving our clothes, and we are really decoupling ourselves from the trend that has exacerbated some of the harm that we're seeing on the planet. So if any of our big stars are listening to CFS Plus this year and to this conversation, let's see you repeat some of those garments and reset the blueprint for this. So let's look into the future a little bit. And Kenya, maybe I want to come to you first. And I want to ask the same question to the both of you. What, when, who? What needs to change? By when do you believe that we need to have had that change in place? Who needs to drive that change? And really the big frame is, if we are going to be able to really drive value and use scale for good, what needs to happen? When does it need to happen? And who needs to drive that change? And maybe Kenya, let me give you an opportunity to go first.
Sure. Going back to a point that I've made earlier, I feel very strongly about partnerships and collaborations. And so who needs to make that change? All of us, between industry, academia, and government. And I've been saying for a while, I would love to see some sort of consortium, some sort of partnership where we have in academia, fashion design programs, engineering programs working on the technological innovations, law with the policies. Rosalina mentioned incentives. A lot of that is going to come from government, but getting that balance right about how to have meaningful incentives without getting pushed pushback from industry, that's going to take a lot of work. I know definitely here in the United States. And then also business schools coming together so they can work with the designers and the retailers and the engineers to have a serious and a solid management and strategy for moving forward. Another area, and I know this came up over the summer at the G20 Circular Fashion workshop, and that is to make sure we are including our youth, especially our youth advocates at every step of the process, because what we do today, what we're all discussing today and tomorrow will impact our youth for years to come. And they will be the ones, even if our governments implement new laws and policies today, oftentimes it's going to be our youth, and they will feel the effects of those policies. And if they're working in government, they may have to implement them as well. And so I would like to see more efforts where we're incorporating our youth. I always try to do that in the classroom to get my students' thoughts as consumers, as intellectuals, and really make sure that they're working with us to push the movement forward.
Sure, I think it's an incredible response, partnerships and collaborations. And as you just begin to pull together some of those areas, it's really exciting. Academia and engineering for technology. It's about leveraging the law for the incentives, business schools and designers. And so the possibilities just layer and layer on top of each other. The idea of being deliberately inclusive about young people, I think, is one that cannot be argued with, especially if we consider that the people with who we are talking about the future are the one who are going to inherit it. And so whatever changes we're pushing for now, these are the changes they're going to have to live with themselves. Rosalina, the same question comes to you. What, when, and who? What needs to be done? When? Who needs to do it if we're really going to be able to drive value and leverage scale for good?
Well, it's difficult to come in after Kenya because she spoke about such exciting things as innovation, technology, engineering. Oh, this is what we really like to see in the future, also from a policy perspective. And once that I turn to the policies that we want to implement, actually already in new legislation, we have an obligation to collect separately textile waste. So that is something which would provide a lot of input for recycling, for changing the way how we see the end of life of textiles, for encouraging more reuse, and so on and so forth. But this is just end of life, and we cannot change everything via end of pipe solutions, because where we have to start is from the beginning, and this is how our clothes are actually designed. And we have something called Sustainable Product Policy Initiative in the EU, where we create a new legislative framework under which we will define criteria, what a sustainable product means, and we will really start at the design phase. And textiles have been identified as one of the priority products because of their impact, to be one of the first to fall under this framework. And then this is really where we have a lot of trust that through design, and this is where we will need all the innovation and technology that and entrepreneurship that could be mobilized in order to make the change. Then, of course, there is this shift towards new ways of consuming and using textiles. There are a lot of innovative models. Of course, there is the reuse and the second hand, but there are also other models, for instance, sharing. When we talk about baby clothes or others where we use them for, we want to have quality, but we use them for a short time, how to ensure that we share more. There is a lot of possibilities there, and then indeed we will have to also invest in new recycling technologies, because currently only maybe 1% of textiles get it to recycling, and the post-consumer textiles just go to landfill, to incineration, causing plastic pollution or greenhouse gas emissions. So that is really not how we should treat waste. And then textile is a particular challenge, and this is where we will have to advance. We also need to take care of the textile, let's say, sector, because it has suffered a lot during the crisis. It has, I mean, we should not only bash it, because the sector has a lot of difficulties. It has to cope currently with a lot of challenges. But what we really hope is that by all these policies, we are working very hard on our textile strategy for the EU, but also that would have a global dimension as well. And we really hope with this to be weaving the ecosystem of tomorrow, so that we have a textile industry that is fit for the digital and the green transition, and then use also all the power that digitalization provides in terms of product information, platforms, new business models, in order to ensure that we go for more sustainable textiles.
Sure. That's Rosalina, you started off your answer by saying you couldn't add more, and you certainly did. I think you've added to a very strong base of responses from Kenya. You know, there's the personal or individual role of collecting textile waste, but you're saying to us, it's not enough just to look at the end of life. Let's be courageous enough to really look at the beginning of life. You've spoken about sustainable product policies, and I would imagine that if there are other policymakers who are watching, they are also now beginning to think, what are the underlying design elements of your policy, and what would it look like in their market or environment? You've spoken about new ways of consuming, and you know, when you talk about sharing, I was transported to what I've seen happening over generations in my own family of sharing baby clothes, as those get handed down from one member of the family to the next. How do we normalize doing this, not only for baby clothes, but just more broadly as a way of living? Of course, you've spoken about the importance of investing in new technologies, to look at the sector more deliberately and ask the question, how can we better support the sector? Now, I think what's really exciting is, as you talk about your textile strategy, if I was a policymaker, I would be asking myself, do we have a textile strategy in our country? What does that look like? And how do we strengthen it and make it more robust? I think the soundbite that stands out for me is weaving ecosystems of tomorrow. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching this conversation and you're not tweeting that phrase, I'm not sure. That was certainly a soundbite to remember. Now, we've got about 5 minutes left. And what I would like to do is I want to bring this conversation back to the bigger theme that the summit has been covering. And that's the theme of growth and prosperity. And I really would love for you to just consider, what is the greatest opportunity for us to ensure that the industry, the fashion industry, can really contribute to growth and really drive prosperity for humanity? And maybe, Kenya, I'm going to bring you first into this conversation. You spoke about social law and social justice. And so I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this one as well.
Sure. Thank you, Nosy. I would like to start out by saying investments in our infrastructure are key and critical right now. Like I said, this is something that we have covered in my class, and making sure that our students are really addressing these issues through the lens of humanity and social justice throughout the process. And so what do I mean by that? And so I started out with saying about talent, right? Making sure that the talent that we have, that they're diverse, right? That they all have a seat at the table, and that we are including their voices. And that is based on race, it's based on culture, gender, and religion, and the list goes on and on. So first of all, DE&I, making sure that this has come up in the context of sustainability here in the US, that we are including indigenous communities in those conversations that use practices that are today called regenerative, but oftentimes those are indigenous land practices that were around before the term was actually coined and termed as regenerative. So making sure that we're inclusive in the design process, in the farming process, raw materials, agriculture, all throughout fashion supply chain and pipeline. And so that's why I feel so blessed to be able to teach as I'm discussing these issues with my students, and they're developing solutions on how to move forward. But going back to Rosalina, I would say that one of the challenges that we have, it's really around the incentives. So as far as policy, that's where the focus needs to be. How can we formulate policies, not just here in the US, but around the world, where we're creating incentives and opportunities for businesses, academia, consumers, for everyone?
Kenya, that's excellent. We've got 2 minutes. Rosalina, I want to get your final thoughts in. How do we ensure that this industry can drive prosperity, and growth?
Well, I would say by what industry has always been doing. I mean, entrepreneurship, innovation, drive, and I guess that it's up indeed to us as policymakers to design the framework conditions in a way that the change can happen. Because I'm sure that there is no task that the business is not up to once that they're given the task. And then the task that we have to give is, let's go for sustainable textiles. Let's make this happen. And this can happen through design requirements, through empowering consumers, through making producers more responsible, both for what they put on the market and what it happens at its second life, end of life. And also by our own power when we go shopping. So that is also something that that is there. So my main message, which with which I began, is to the industry is let us love our clothes.
Let us love our clothes indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, as we close it off, invest in infrastructure, invest in talent, make sure it is inclusive and diverse. Go back to indigenous practices. Look at entrepreneurship. Let's unlock innovation. Let's be courageous in our policy formulation and design. And with that, I would like to say a massive thank you to Kenya Wiley, a massive thank you to Rosalina Petrova. You've been absolutely excellent. Coming up next, if you're watching, is how brands can overcome greenwash skepticism in advertising. For myself, Nozipho Shabalala, at the tip of the African continent in Johannesburg, it's goodbye for now.